Jack Tenner's hands went numb when he saw 15 pure white colts stampede across his fence line, their eyes wild with a fear that turned his stomach to ice. His dead grandfather's journal had warned they would appear exactly 3 days before everything in the valley died. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Jack Tenner had learned to trust his instincts during 23 years of working the high country, and right now every instinct he possessed was screaming that something was wrong. The morning had started ordinary enough, with the kind of crystalline October sky that made a man grateful to be alive and working land that stretched from his porch all the way to the distant peaks of the Colorado Rockies. He had finished his coffee, checked on the cattle in the south pasture, and was heading back toward the barn when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the usual symphony of ranch life, not the lowing of cattle or the cry of hawks circling overhead, but something else entirely. A rhythmic thunder that grew louder with each passing second. Jack stopped in his tracks, one hand instinctively moving to shade his eyes against the brilliant morning sun. The sound was coming from the east, from the direction of the open range that bordered his property. Hoofbeats, many of them. His first thought was that some of his cattle had broken through the fence again, but the tempo was all wrong. These were lighter, faster, moving with a purpose that spoke of something beyond mere grazing animals wandering aimlessly across the prairie. Then he saw them. At first they were just a shimmer on the horizon like heat waves rising from sun-baked earth. But as they drew closer, the shimmer resolved into individual shapes, and Jack felt his breath catch in his throat. Horses. No, not just horses. Colts. Young ones, maybe a year old, moving in a tight formation like a cavalry unit responding to some unheard command. And they were white. Every single one of them was pure white, their coats gleaming like fresh snow against the golden autumn grass. Jack had been around horses his entire life. He had broken mustangs, trained workhorses, and raised enough foals to know that what he was seeing made no sense whatsoever. Wild horses came in all colors, but to see 15 colts, all white, all the same approximate age, all moving together with such coordination, that was beyond unusual. That was impossible. Yet there they were, heading straight for his ranch as if they knew exactly where they were going. His mare Sadie nickered nervously from the corral, picking up on whatever strange energy these approaching animals carried with them. Jack moved quickly to the fence rail, his mind racing through possibilities. Had they escaped from some breeder's operation? But there were no major horse ranches within 50 miles, and certainly none that specialized in white colts. Had they been abandoned? But why would anyone abandon 15 valuable young horses in the middle of nowhere? And why were they coming here, to his small ranch tucked into the foothills where he ran cattle and kept a handful of horses for work and companionship? The colts were close enough now that he could see individual details. They were beautiful creatures, perfectly formed despite their youth, with intelligent eyes and graceful movements that suggested good bloodlines. Their manes and tails flowed like silk as they ran, and there was something almost ethereal about the way they moved together, as if connected by invisible threads. They showed no signs of exhaustion despite what must have been a long journey, and their pace never faltered as they approached the ranch boundary. Jack's property was marked by a simple 3-rail fence that kept his cattle contained, but would pose no obstacle to determined horses. He watched, transfixed, as the lead colt, slightly larger than the others, cleared the fence with a leap that would have made any jumping horse proud. The others followed in quick succession, flowing over the barrier like water over stones. And then they were inside his property, slowing their pace but still moving purposefully toward the heart of the ranch. "They keep coming," Jack muttered to himself, his voice a mixture of wonder and disbelief. He had dealt with plenty of unexpected situations in his years of ranching. He had weathered blizzards that buried the ranch under 6 feet of snow, survived droughts that turned the grass to dust, and faced down predators that threatened his livestock. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for this. 15 white colts appearing out of nowhere, seeking something he couldn't begin to understand. The colts came to a halt near the barn, forming a loose semicircle as if waiting for something, or someone. Their sides heaved slightly from their exertion, but their eyes remained calm, alert, watching Jack with an intensity that made him deeply uncomfortable. Animals didn't look at people that way, at least normal animals didn't. These colts were looking at him as if they recognized him, as if they had been searching specifically for Jack Tenner and his small ranch in the Colorado foothills. Jack Tenner was not a fanciful man. He believed in hard work, honest dealing, and the things he could see and touch and understand. But standing there in his dusty yard, watching 15 impossible white colts who had appeared from nowhere, he felt the foundations of his practical worldview beginning to shift. Whatever was happening here, it was beyond his experience, beyond his understanding, and he had the distinct feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't possibly anticipate. The question was whether he was ready to find out why these mysterious animals had chosen his ranch as their destination. Jack approached the colts slowly, keeping his movements calm and deliberate the way he had learned to do around skittish animals. His boots crunched softly on the gravel as he closed the distance between himself and the semicircle of white horses. Every nerve in his body was alert, ready to retreat if they showed any signs of aggression or panic. But the colts simply watched him with those unnervingly intelligent eyes, their ears pricked forward in what seemed like anticipation rather than fear. The lead colt, the one that had cleared the fence first, stepped forward to meet him. Jack stopped, giving the young horse space to decide how close it wanted to come. The colt moved with confidence unusual for an animal its age, showing none of the nervous energy that typically characterized yearlings. When it was within arm's reach, it stretched its neck toward Jack, nostrils flaring as it took in his scent. Jack remained perfectly still, letting the animal complete its inspection. Then, to his astonishment, the colt lowered its head and pressed its forehead gently against his chest. The gesture was so deliberate, so clearly intentional, that Jack felt goosebumps rise on his arms despite the warmth of the morning sun. This was not normal horse behavior. This was something else entirely. He raised one hand slowly and placed it on the colt's neck, feeling the warmth of its coat, the strong pulse of its heartbeat beneath the skin. The animal was real, solid, undeniably present. Not a hallucination brought on by too much solitude or too much sun. Real. As soon as Jack touched the lead colt, the others began to move. They didn't rush or crowd him, but instead formed a line, each waiting its turn to approach and receive the same gentle acknowledgement. It was like watching a receiving line at some formal gathering, except the participants were horses who had no business behaving with such deliberate courtesy. Jack found himself moving down the line almost without conscious thought, placing his hand on each white neck, feeling the life and warmth beneath each pristine coat, searching for some explanation in each pair of eyes that met his. By the time he reached the 15th colt, the smallest of the group, Jack's mind was spinning with questions that had no rational answers. Where had they come from? Why were they here? And why did he have the overwhelming feeling that they had been sent, that their arrival at his ranch was no accident, but the result of some purpose he couldn't begin to comprehend? The small colt nuzzled his hand with unexpected gentleness, and Jack felt something shift in his chest, a sense of responsibility settling over him like a mantle he hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. He stepped back and surveyed the group as a whole. 15 white colts, healthy and strong, standing in his yard like they owned the place, like they belonged here. Jack ran a hand through his graying hair and let out a long breath. Whatever was happening, he couldn't just leave them standing in the open. The practical part of his brain, The part that had kept the ranch running through good years and bad, kicked into gear. First things first, the Colts would need water, food, and shelter. He could figure out the mystery later. The water trough near the barn was full, fed by the spring that had made this particular piece of land valuable when his grandfather had claimed it 70 years ago. Jack gestured toward it, not really expecting the Colts to understand. But the lead Colt immediately moved toward the trough, and the others followed in orderly fashion. They drank deeply, but not frantically, taking turns at the water with the same bizarre courtesy they had shown in greeting him. Jack shook his head in disbelief. He had seen trained horses with worse manners than these supposedly wild colts. While they drank, Jack walked to the barn and began pulling down hay from the loft. His hands worked automatically, drawing on decades of muscle memory, while his mind continued to wrestle with the impossibility of the situation. He distributed the hay in several piles around the yard, giving the colts room to spread out and eat without competition. Again, they surprised him. Instead of rushing the food, they waited until he had finished setting out all the piles before approaching, and then they divided themselves evenly among the offerings. Jack leaned against the barn wall and watched them eat. The morning sun was climbing higher now, warming the air and casting everything in that perfect golden light that made the high country so beautiful. Under normal circumstances, he would have been enjoying the peace of the scene. A bunch of healthy young horses eating breakfast in his yard should have been a pleasant sight. But there was nothing normal about this situation, and the peace he usually found in morning ranch work eluded him completely. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of an approaching vehicle. Jack turned to see a dust cloud rising from the dirt road that led to his property. Company was rare this far from town, and the timing of a visitor on this particular morning struck him as more than coincidental. As the vehicle drew closer, he recognized the battered green pickup truck that belonged to Doc Halstead, the veterinarian who served the ranches scattered across the county. The truck pulled to a stop near the house, and Doc Halstead climbed out, a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of a life spent outdoors. He took one look at the white colts scattered around Jack's yard and stopped dead in his tracks. His expression cycled through surprise, confusion, and finally settled on something that looked almost like recognition. That last reaction caught Jack's attention more than anything else that had happened that morning. Doc Halstead stood motionless beside his truck for a long moment, his eyes moving from one white colt to another, as if counting them. Jack watched the veterinarian's face carefully, noting the way the older man's jaw tightened and his hands clenched at his sides. Whatever Doc was thinking, it wasn't good news. Jack pushed himself away from the barn wall and walked toward his unexpected visitor, grateful for another human presence even as he dreaded what that presence might mean. "They've come to you then," Doc said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made the simple statement sound like a pronouncement of fate. Jack stopped a few feet away, studying the veterinarian's expression. The two men had known each other for 15 years, ever since Jack had taken over the ranch after his father's death, and in all that time Jack had never seen Doc Halstead look quite like this. There was fear in the older man's eyes, but also something else. Resignation, maybe, or acceptance of something inevitable. "You know what this is about," Jack said. It wasn't a question. Doc nodded slowly, finally tearing his gaze away from the colts to look directly at Jack. He seemed to be weighing his words carefully, deciding how much to reveal. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft sounds of the colts moving around the yard and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Jack waited, his patience born of years spent working with animals who couldn't be rushed. "Your grandfather told me a story once," Doc began, his voice low as if he feared being overheard despite the isolation of the ranch. "This was maybe 40 years ago, back when I was just starting my practice. I thought he was pulling my leg, telling tall tales the way old-timers sometimes do, but he was serious, deadly serious. He made me promise that if I ever saw what he described, I would come straight to whoever was running this ranch and tell them what I knew. Jack felt cold fingers of apprehension trace down his spine despite the morning warmth. Doc gestured toward the white Colts. He told me about horses like these. Said they appeared every few generations, always 15 of them, always white as fresh snow, always seeking out this particular piece of land. He called them the sanctuary seekers. Said they came when something bad was approaching, something that threatened not just the horses themselves but the whole territory. They were supposed to be a warning and a test. Jack's mouth went dry. A warning of what, and a test of what exactly? The veterinarian shook his head. He wasn't entirely clear on the details, or maybe he didn't want to tell me everything. Your grandfather could be close-mouthed when he wanted to be, but he said the horses would come seeking shelter and whoever owned this land would have to decide whether to protect them or turn them away. The choice would have consequences either way. He looked at Jack with an expression that mixed sympathy and concern. Looks like that choice has fallen to you. Jack turned to look at the Colts again. They had finished eating and were now simply standing in loose groups around the yard, their white coats gleaming in the sunlight like beacons. They seemed so ordinary in some ways, just young horses doing horse things. But that strange intelligence in their eyes, that uncanny coordination in their movements, those things spoke to something beyond the ordinary, something that made his grandfather's story seem less like folklore and more like prophecy. "Did my father know about this?" Jack asked. "Did he ever mention these horses to you?" Doc shook his head. "If your grandfather told him, he never spoke of it to me. But then, your father passed young, didn't he? Heart attack at 52. Maybe he never expected to see the horses in his lifetime." The implication hung heavy in the air. Jack's father had died suddenly, leaving Jack to take over the ranch at 30 years old, unprepared and overwhelmed by the responsibility. Now, 13 years later, Jack was facing a test his father had never had to endure. "What happens if I keep them?" Jack asked. "And what happens if I don't?" Doc's expression grew grave. "I don't know for certain. Your grandfather wouldn't say or couldn't, but he made it clear that turning them away would bring disaster. Not just to you or to the horses, but to everyone in the valley. As for keeping them, well, he said that would bring its own challenges. Danger, he called it. Said protecting the sanctuary seekers would require courage and sacrifice." Jack laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "So my choices are disaster or danger. That's quite a decision to wake up to on a Tuesday morning." He ran his hand through his hair again, a nervous gesture he'd had since childhood. "I'm a cattle rancher, Doc. I'm not equipped to deal with prophecies and mystical horses and threats to the whole valley. I barely keep this operation profitable from year to year. How am I supposed to protect 15 horses from some unnamed danger?" "Your grandfather seemed to think the land would provide what you needed," Doc replied. "He said this ranch, this specific piece of ground, had power, protection. That's why the horses come here. That's why your family has held on to this property through droughts and depressions and everything else that's tried to drive you out. The land protects those who protect it." Jack wanted to dismiss the words as nonsense, the kind of mystical thinking that had no place in the modern world of profit margins and weather forecasts and veterinary science. But he couldn't dismiss what he was seeing with his own eyes. 15 white colts that had appeared from nowhere, moving with purpose and intelligence beyond anything he'd encountered in 2 decades of working with horses. He couldn't dismiss the feeling he'd had when the lead colt pressed its forehead to his chest, that sense of connection and responsibility that had settled over him like a physical weight. And he couldn't dismiss the timing of Doc Halstead's arrival, coming to deliver a message from a grandfather who had been dead for 5 years. The lead colt chose that moment to approach them, walking with that same confident grace Jack had noticed earlier. It came straight to Jack, ignoring Doc entirely, and once again pressed its forehead against his chest. The gesture felt like a question, or maybe a plea. Jack placed his hand on the colt's neck, feeling the warmth and the steady heartbeat, and knew his decision had already been made. Whatever was coming, whatever danger these horses represented or brought with them, he would face it. He would protect them. "I'll keep them," Jack said, the words coming out firm and certain, despite the uncertainty churning in his gut. Doc Halstead nodded, as if he had expected nothing less, but his expression remained troubled. The lead colt stepped back from Jack, tossing its white mane in what looked almost like approval, then returned to join the others. Jack watched them for a moment before turning back to the veterinarian. "So what do I do now? What exactly am I protecting them from?" Doc reached into his truck and pulled out a worn leather journal, its cover cracked with age and use. "Your grandfather gave me this before he died. Made me promise to keep it safe and give it to you if the horses ever came. Said everything you'd need to know would be in here." He handed the journal to Jack, who took it with hands that trembled slightly, despite his effort to appear calm. The leather was soft from years of handling, and when Jack opened it, he recognized his grandfather's distinctive handwriting filling page after page. The first entry was dated 1952, the year Jack's grandfather had been 30 years old. Jack had been born that same year, though he wouldn't know it until he read further. The words on the page were stark and direct, written in the no-nonsense style his grandfather had employed for everything from grocery lists to letters to the county commissioners. Today they came. 15 white colts, just like my grandfather said they would, just like his grandfather before him. The pattern continues, and now it's my turn to stand watch. Jack looked up from the journal, his mind reeling. This had happened before, multiple times. Doc nodded at his unspoken question. 3 times that I know of, counting today. Once to your great-great-grandfather in 1882, once to your grandfather in 1952, and now to you. Each time, the horses came seeking sanctuary. Each time they brought warning of something terrible approaching, and each time the man who owned this land had to decide whether to protect them or turn them away. "What were they running from?" Jack asked, flipping through the journal pages, catching fragments of entries that spoke of preparations, of watching the horizon, of sleepless nights and constant vigilance. His grandfather's handwriting grew more hurried and jagged as the entries progressed, the words betraying stress and fear even as they maintained a determined tone. What danger could possibly require mystical horses to warn us about it? Doc's expression grew darker. In 1882, it was a gang of outlaws who'd been raiding ranches across 3 territories. They were looking for horses to steal, and anyone who got in their way ended up dead. Your great-great-grandfather protected the white colts, and the gang came here looking for them. The story goes that when the outlaws tried to take the horses, the land itself rose up to defend them. Rockslide blocked the only road in or out, trapped the outlaws in the valley until the marshal could arrive. All of them hanged for their crimes. "And in 1952, Jack asked, dreading the answer. "What was my grandfather protecting the colts from then?" Doc's jaw tightened. "That one's harder to explain. It wasn't outlaws or anything you could shoot at. It was disease, a strange sickness that swept through every ranch in the valley, killed livestock by the hundreds. Horses, cattle, sheep, everything. Except here. This ranch didn't lose a single animal. Your grandfather wrote it all down in that journal. How the sickness seemed to stop at his property line, how other ranchers begged him to tell them his secret, but there was no secret to tell except the white colts standing in his pasture." Jack felt his stomach drop. "So the danger isn't always something you can fight with a gun. Sometimes it's something invisible, something that can destroy everything you've built without ever showing its face." The implications were staggering. He looked at the Colts again, seeing them with new eyes. They weren't just mysterious animals seeking shelter. They were harbingers, warnings of catastrophe, and somehow their presence at his ranch would determine whether he survived what was coming. "The question is what's coming this time," Doc said quietly. "What disaster are they warning you about? What are you supposed to protect them from, and what will protecting them cost you?" Jack had no answers. He stood there in his dusty yard, holding his grandfather's journal, watching 15 impossible white horses, and tried to imagine what could be threatening enough to require supernatural intervention. The world of 2023 was different from 1952 and vastly different from 1882. Modern problems required modern solutions, didn't they? But even as he thought it, he knew better. Some things never changed. Greed, violence, disease, disaster. These were constants across generations. The specifics might vary, but the fundamental threats remained the same. And if his grandfather and great-great-grandfather had faced those threats with nothing but courage and the mysterious protection of white horses, then Jack would do the same. He had no choice. The moment he had decided to keep the Colts, he had committed himself to whatever was coming. Doc seemed to read his thoughts. "You should read the journal carefully. Your grandfather left detailed instructions about what to do when the horses arrived. How to care for them, how to watch for signs of the approaching danger, how to prepare yourself and the ranch for what's coming." He paused, then added more gently, "And Jack, you should know that you don't have to face this alone. There are others in the valley who remember the old stories, who believe in things that can't be explained by science or logic. If you need help, there are people you can call on." Jack nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed it. The ranchers he knew were practical people who dealt in cattle prices and weather patterns, not mystical prophecies and supernatural horses. But then again, he would have said the same thing about himself yesterday. 24 hours ago, he had been a simple rancher worried about his profit margins and whether he could afford to replace the tractor that kept breaking down. Now he was the guardian of 15 white Colts and the unwitting participant in a pattern that stretched back generations. The sun was approaching its zenith, the morning giving way to afternoon with the steady inevitability of time passing. Jack looked down at the journal in his hands, then back at Doc Halstead. "Thank you for bringing this, and for telling me what you knew. I'll read it carefully and figure out what I need to do." The veterinarian nodded, but his expression remained concerned. He climbed back into his truck, then paused with one hand on the door. "One more thing your grandfather told me," Doc said. "He said the hardest part wasn't the danger when it came. The hardest part was the waiting, not knowing when or how it would arrive. He said it tested him more than the actual fight did. So be prepared for that, Jack. Be prepared for the uncertainty and the fear and the doubt. Those will be your real enemies before whatever's coming actually shows up." With that sobering advice, Doc started his truck and drove away, leaving Jack alone with 15 white Colts and a leather journal full of warnings from the past. That evening, Jack sat on his porch with his grandfather's journal open on his lap and a glass of whiskey at his elbow. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. But tonight, Jack barely noticed the spectacular display. His attention was fixed on the pages before him, on words written 70 years ago by a man he had loved and respected but never truly known. The white Colts had settled themselves in the pasture closest to the house, forming a loose circle as if keeping watch. Jack could see them from where he sat, their white forms almost glowing in the fading light. They hadn't wandered or tried to explore the ranch. They simply stayed close, alert and watchful, waiting for something only they could sense. The sight of them sent shivers down Jack's spine despite the lingering warmth of the day. He turned to the entry dated 3 days after the Colts had arrived in 1952. His grandfather's handwriting was tight and controlled, but Jack could sense the tension beneath the carefully formed letters. "They don't eat much," the entry read. "Less than normal horses their size should need. And they never all sleep at the same time. There's always at least 3 or 4 standing watch, ears forward, eyes on the horizon. It's like they know something's coming, and they're counting down the hours until it arrives." Jack took a sip of whiskey and continued reading. His grandfather had been methodical in his observations, noting everything about the Colts' behavior, their routines, the way they interacted with each other and with the land around them. But interspersed with these practical observations were entries that spoke to the emotional toll of waiting for an unknown threat. "I find myself jumping at shadows," one entry confessed. "Every sound in the night makes me reach for my rifle. Sarah thinks I'm losing my mind. Maybe I am. How do you explain to your wife that you're protecting magical horses from an invisible enemy?" Sarah, Jack's grandmother. She had died when he was 12, a quiet woman who had run the household with gentle efficiency while his grandfather managed the ranch. Had she known about the white colts? Had his grandfather told her the truth, or had he carried this burden alone? The journal suggested the latter, and Jack felt a pang of sympathy for the man who had faced this impossible situation with no one to confide in. The next several entries documented his grandfather's preparations. He had reinforced the fences around the property, stockpiled food and supplies, and purchased ammunition for the rifles he kept in the house. But he had also done something else, something that puzzled Jack until he read the explanation. "I've been walking the boundaries of the property every morning and evening," the entry read. "Not just checking fences, but really walking them, placing my feet on this land, feeling it beneath me, trying to understand what Doc meant when he said the land would protect those who protect it." Jack set the journal down and looked out at his own land, the rolling hills and distant mountains that had been in his family for 3 generations. He had never thought of the property as anything more than dirt and grass and water, resources to be managed and utilized for the raising of cattle. But reading his grandfather's words, he began to wonder if there was something more. Some connection between the land and the people who worked it, some bargain struck long ago that he was only now beginning to understand. He picked up the journal again and flipped forward, looking for the entries that would tell him what had actually happened. What danger had manifested? How had his grandfather dealt with it? The pages he needed were near the end of the journal, dated in late November of 1952. The handwriting here was almost illegible, scrawled in obvious haste and stress. "It started," the first entry read. "The Peterson Ranch reported sick cattle this morning. By afternoon, 3 more ranches called with the same problem. Animals dropping dead in the fields with no warning, no symptoms except sudden collapse." Jack's hands tightened on the journal. He remembered Doc Halstead mentioning disease, but reading his grandfather's first-hand account made it real in a way the second-hand story hadn't. The next entry was even more disturbing. "The sickness is spreading faster than anything I've ever seen. Every ranch in the valley has lost animals except ours. The white colts stand in the pasture, and it's like there's an invisible barrier around this property that the disease can't cross. People are starting to notice, starting to ask questions I don't know how to answer." The entries that followed painted a picture of growing desperation as the valley's ranchers watched their livelihoods die around them. His grandfather had tried to help, had offered his land as a refuge for other people's animals, but the protection didn't extend beyond the property boundaries. Animals brought onto the ranch would sicken and die as soon as they left. The only creatures that remained healthy were those that had been on the land before the white colts arrived, and the colts themselves. Then came the entry Jack had been dreading. Marcus Chen came to the ranch today with 5 other men. They weren't here to ask for help anymore. They came with guns and demands. They want the white horses. They think if they take the Colts, the protection will go with them. They think they can force the land to save their ranches instead of mine. I tried to explain that it doesn't work that way, but desperate men don't listen to reason. Jack's heart was pounding as he read the next page. There was a confrontation. His grandfather had refused to hand over the Colts and the situation had turned violent. But before shots could be fired, something extraordinary had happened. The entry was almost incoherent in places, but the essential facts were clear. The earth had moved. Not an earthquake exactly, but something similar. The ground beneath the intruders' feet had become unstable, shifting and rolling like water, forcing them back toward the property line. And at the boundary they had stopped, unable to cross back onto land that had rejected them. The land chose, his grandfather had written. I didn't defend it. The land defended itself and the creatures it had agreed to protect. The men left, terrified and angry, and I stood there watching them go, wondering what I had become part of, wondering if I was still just a rancher or if I had become something else entirely, something older and stranger than I ever imagined possible. Jack closed the journal and sat in the gathering darkness, trying to process what he had read. His grandfather had faced armed neighbors who blamed him for their losses. He had watched the land itself rise up to protect the mysterious horses that had sought sanctuary on his property. And somehow, he had come through it all intact, had lived another 40 years, and never spoke of it to anyone except Doc Halstead. The weight of that silence pressed down on Jack like a physical thing. His grandfather had carried this knowledge alone, had faced this test without support or understanding, and had chosen to protect the mystery rather than explain it. Now that same burden had fallen to Jack, and he had no idea if he possessed the strength or courage to bear it. The white colts moved in the pasture, and Jack wondered what was coming. Jack woke before dawn the next morning to the sound of the white colts calling out in unison. It wasn't the typical whinny or neigh of horses, but something else entirely, a sound that seemed to resonate in his chest and raise the hair on the back of his neck. He was out of bed and pulling on his boots before he was fully conscious, his grandfather's warnings about watching for signs fresh in his mind from hours spent reading the journal late into the night. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten as Jack hurried out to the pasture where the colts had settled. They were all on their feet, facing south, their white bodies tense with an alertness that bordered on fear. The lead colt turned its head as Jack approached, and the look in its eyes confirmed his worst suspicions. Whatever was coming had begun. The waiting period his grandfather had warned about was over. Jack stood among the colts, following their gaze toward the southern horizon, but he could see nothing unusual. The land stretched away in its familiar patterns of hills and valleys, the grass still wet with morning dew, the sky clear and promising another beautiful autumn day. Yet the colts remained rigid with attention, their ears forward, their nostrils flaring as if scenting something on the wind that Jack's merely human senses couldn't detect. He stayed with them until full daylight, watching and waiting, but nothing visible emerged from the south. Finally, as the sun cleared the mountains and warmth began to spread across the land, the colts relaxed slightly. They didn't resume their normal behavior, but the sharp edge of their alertness dulled to something more like constant vigilance. Jack headed back to the house to make coffee and check his phone for any news that might explain their reaction. What he found made his blood run cold. 3 messages from neighboring ranchers, all reporting the same thing. Cattle were acting strangely, bunching together in tight groups and refusing to graze. Horses were nervous and difficult to handle, and several ranchers mentioned that their dogs had been barking at nothing all night, facing south, hackles raised in response to a threat that couldn't be seen or heard. Jack called Tom Henderson, whose ranch bordered his to the east. The older man answered on the first ring, his voice tight with worry. "You seeing it too, Jack? Your animals acting spooked?" "My dogs didn't sleep all night, And this morning my horses won't come near the south fence. It's like there's something out there they can sense, but I can't." "Yeah," Jack replied, looking out his window at the white colts standing watch in the pasture. "I'm seeing it. You have any idea what's causing it?" Tom was quiet for a long moment. "There's talk in town. Some kind of chemical spill, maybe, or contamination from that old mining operation up in the hills. The EPA was out there last month doing tests. Maybe they found something bad and didn't tell us." The explanation was plausible, grounded in the kind of modern environmental concerns that made sense to rational people. But Jack thought about his grandfather's journal, about disease that had killed hundreds of animals in 1952, and he knew this was something different, something older and more dangerous than chemical contamination. He thanked Tom for the information and hung up, his mind racing through possibilities he didn't want to consider. By mid-morning, Jack's phone was ringing constantly. Ranchers throughout the valley were experiencing the same phenomena. Animals acting strange, all of them focused on the south, all of them displaying the kind of fear that came from sensing a predator or a threat to their survival. The local news had picked up the story, and reporters were beginning to call, asking if Jack had noticed anything unusual on his property. He lied to them, saying his animals were fine, everything was normal. It wasn't entirely false. His cattle were nervous, yes, but they hadn't bunched together or stopped grazing the way other herds had. And the white colts, while vigilant, weren't panicking. It was as if the protection his grandfather had written about was already in effect, shielding his ranch from the worst of whatever was approaching. That afternoon, Sarah Chen arrived at his door. She was the granddaughter of Marcus Chen, the man who had confronted Jack's grandfather in 1952. Sarah was in her 30s, a wildlife biologist who had returned to the valley after years working for the Forest Service in other parts of the state. Jack had known her casually for years, but they had never been close. Her appearance at his ranch surprised him. "I know about the white horses," she said without preamble when he opened the door. "My grandfather told me the story before he died. About what happened in 1952, about how your grandfather's ranch was the only one that survived the disease. He made me promise that if I ever heard about white horses appearing at your place, I would come and offer whatever help I could." Jack stared at her, processing this unexpected revelation. "Your grandfather tried to take the colts by force. Why would he want you to help protect them now?" Sarah's expression was pained. "Because he spent the rest of his life regretting that decision. He lost half his herd to the disease, and he knew it was his own fault. He knew the protection was offered to everyone, but only through your grandfather's willingness to shelter the horses. When he tried to take that by force instead of asking for help, he broke something. Some trust or agreement that couldn't be repaired." She gestured toward the pasture where the white colts stood watch. "Whatever's coming now, it's big. I've been monitoring wildlife patterns across the region for weeks, and everything's wrong. Migration routes are changing, predator behavior is shifting, even the insects are acting strangely. Something's approaching from the south, something that's disrupting every ecosystem it touches. And it's heading straight for this valley." Jack invited her inside and showed her his grandfather's journal. Together they read through the entries, comparing the 1952 crisis with what was happening now. The parallels were disturbing. The animals' behavior matched almost exactly. The directional focus on the south, the sense of approaching catastrophe that couldn't yet be defined or measured. But there were differences too. The scale seemed larger this time, the area of effect wider, and the variety of species reacting suggested something more comprehensive than disease. "What do you think it is?" Jack asked. Sarah had spread maps across his kitchen table, marking locations where unusual animal behavior had been reported. She traced a line from south to north, showing the progression of the disturbance over the past month. "It's moving at about 15 miles a day," she said. "Whatever it is, it's not natural. Natural phenomena don't move with this kind of consistency. And look at this." She pointed to several locations along the path. Every place it's passed through, we're seeing massive die-offs. Not just livestock, but wild animals, birds, fish in the streams, everything. Jack felt sick. A wave of death moving steadily north, killing everything in its path and heading directly toward his valley. How long until it gets here? Sarah did the math quickly. 3 days, maybe 4. The white Colts showed up yesterday, which means they sensed it coming from much further away than any normal animal could. Their early warning systems, Jack. They came to the one place that has a history of surviving this kind of threat. The one place where the land itself might be able to stop what's coming. The weight of responsibility settled over Jack like a shroud. 3 or 4 days to prepare for something that had killed his grandfather's neighbors, something that was now apparently worse than it had been 70 years ago. He looked at Sarah, this unexpected ally who had appeared because of a deathbed promise from a man who had once been his grandfather's enemy. Together, they would have to figure out how to protect not just 15 white horses, but an entire valley of people and animals who had no idea what was heading their way. Jack and Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon contacting every rancher in the valley, warning them about what was coming. Most dismissed their concerns with a kind of polite skepticism reserved for people who had been out in the sun too long. A few listened with genuine interest, remembering old stories their own grandparents had told. But nobody really believed that something as abstract as a wave of death could be moving toward them with the inevitability of a storm front. Tom Henderson was the exception. When Jack explained what Sarah's research had shown, the older rancher was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "My grandfather lost everything in 1952. I was just a kid, but I remember how he used to look at your grandfather's place with this mixture of anger and respect. He never told me the whole story, but he always said there was something special about your land, something that went back further than any of us understood." Jack felt a flicker of hope. "Will you help us? We need to get the word out, convince people to take precautions even if they don't believe the full story." Tom agreed immediately, and within an hour he had called 3 other ranchers who remembered the 1952 crisis or had heard family stories about it. By evening, Jack had a small network of allies who were willing to at least consider that something unprecedented might be approaching. Sarah stayed through dinner, the 2 of them working at Jack's kitchen table to develop some kind of plan. The problem was that they had no idea what they were dealing with. The wave of death Sarah had been tracking wasn't a disease in any conventional sense. Animals weren't getting sick and dying over days or weeks. They were simply dropping dead with no warning, no symptoms, no explanation that made sense to modern science or veterinary medicine. "What did your grandfather do to prepare?" Sarah asked, pointing to the journal. Jack flipped to the relevant pages and read aloud. "He walked the property boundaries every day. He made sure the white Colts had everything they needed. And he waited. That's it. He didn't build barriers or create quarantine zones or do anything that would make sense if he was fighting disease. He just walked the land and waited for it to protect itself." Sarah frowned. "That doesn't give us much to work with. We can't just tell people to walk around their properties and hope for the best." Jack understood her frustration, but he was beginning to see a pattern in his grandfather's behavior. The walking wasn't about exercise or fence inspection. It was about connection, about reinforcing the bond between the land and the person who worked it, about showing the land that he was committed to protecting it and everything on it. "I think we need to convince people to bring their animals here," Jack said slowly, the idea forming as he spoke. "Not all of them. That would be impossible. But representative groups. A few cattle from each herd, some horses, the family dogs, whatever they care about most. If the protection extends to everything on this property when the wave hits, then we can save at least some of each person's livestock." Sarah looked skeptical. Your grandfather's journal says the protection didn't extend beyond the property boundaries. Animals he tried to save by bringing them here would die as soon as they left. How does that help anyone? Jack shook his head. They died when they left during the crisis. But what if they stayed here until after the wave passed? What if the protection isn't about the property itself, but about being here at the moment the threat arrives? It was a gamble, a theory based on nothing but hope and incomplete information from 70 years ago, but it was better than doing nothing. Sarah reluctantly agreed that it was worth trying, and they began making calls. The response was mixed. Some ranchers agreed to send a few animals, viewing it as a harmless precaution even if they didn't fully believe the threat was real. Others refused outright, unwilling to disrupt their operations for what they saw as unfounded panic. By nightfall, Jack had commitments from 12 families to bring animals to his ranch the next day. It wasn't everyone in the valley, but it was a start. He and Sarah worked into the evening, setting up temporary corrals and fencing to accommodate the influx of livestock. The white colts watched their activity with what seemed like approval, the lead colt occasionally approaching Jack as if checking on their progress. Around midnight, as they were finishing the last corral, Sarah stopped and looked at Jack in the darkness. "Why are you doing this? You could just focus on protecting your own property, your own animals. Instead, you're risking everything to help people who mostly think you're crazy." Jack leaned against a fence post, exhausted and uncertain. "Because my grandfather tried to help, and I think that mattered. I think the land recognized his willingness to share the protection, even when it didn't work the way he hoped. Maybe this time it will be different, B." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather spent the last 30 years of his life regretting that he didn't ask for help, instead of trying to take it by force. He said the biggest lesson he learned was that some things can't be stolen or forced. They have to be offered and accepted freely. Maybe that's what this is really about. Not just protecting the white colts, but proving that we've learned that lesson." They worked in comfortable silence after that, two people brought together by family history and an approaching catastrophe. By the time they finished, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Jack's second day as guardian of the white colts was beginning, and according to Sarah's calculations, they had less than 72 hours before the wave of death reached the valley. The white colts had gathered in a tight circle near the barn, all of them facing south, their white forms ghostly in the pre-dawn light. Jack walked over to them, and the lead colt turned its head to look at him. In the animal's eyes, Jack saw something he hadn't noticed before. Not just intelligence, but recognition. These horses knew him, or at least knew what he represented. They had chosen his ranch not randomly but deliberately, seeking out the descendant of the man who had protected their predecessors 70 years ago. "I won't let you down," Jack whispered to the lead colt. "Whatever's coming, we'll face it together." The colt pressed its forehead against his chest in that now familiar gesture of trust and connection, and Jack felt something shift inside him. The fear and uncertainty were still there, but they were joined by something else now. Determination. Purpose. The understanding that he had been preparing for this moment his entire life, even if he hadn't known it until the white colts appeared in his yard. Sarah came to stand beside him, looking at the colts with an expression of wonder. "They're beautiful and terrifying, both at the same time." Jack nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The colts represented hope and danger in equal measure, the promise of protection and the certainty of threat. They were harbingers of crisis, but also symbols of survival. And for the next 3 days, they would be the focal point of everything that mattered in this small valley tucked into the Colorado mountains. The next morning brought a steady stream of trucks and trailers up the dirt road to Jack's ranch. Tom Henderson arrived first, hauling a trailer with 6 of his best cattle and his 2 working horses. Behind him came the Martinez family, with a mixed group of livestock, then the Johnsons, the Petersons, and others. By mid-morning, Jack's property was crowded with animals from a dozen different ranches, all of them nervous and skittish, but manageable within the corrals he and Sarah had constructed. The white colts observed the arrivals with apparent interest, moving among the temporary pens as if inspecting each new group of animals. Wherever they walked, the visiting livestock calmed noticeably. Nervous horses stopped pawing the ground. Agitated cattle settled into steady chewing. Even the dogs that had been barking nonstop fell silent when the white colts approached. It was as if the colts were extending their protection to these newcomers, welcoming them into the sanctuary. Jack worked alongside the ranchers who had brought their animals, helping to unload and settle the livestock into their temporary homes. The atmosphere was strange, a mixture of neighborly cooperation and underlying tension. Most of the people helping didn't truly believe in the threat. They were humoring Jack, treating this as an eccentric but harmless precaution. But a few, the older ones who remembered family stories or who had lived through the 1952 crisis themselves, worked with grim determination. They knew something was coming, even if they couldn't explain what. Sarah had set up a command center of sorts in Jack's kitchen, tracking the wave's progress on her laptop and fielding calls from other biologists who were monitoring the phenomenon. The news wasn't good. The wave had accelerated slightly, now moving at nearly 20 miles per day. It would reach the southern edge of the valley by tomorrow afternoon, a full day earlier than their initial estimate. They had less time than they thought. When Jack came inside for lunch, he found Sarah staring at her computer screen with an expression of profound distress. She turned the laptop toward him, showing satellite imagery of an area 200 miles to the south. The images showed a landscape that looked normal in most respects, but with one glaring exception. Nothing was moving. No animals, no birds, no visible signs of life whatsoever. It was as if someone had frozen the entire ecosystem in place. "That's from this morning," Sarah said quietly. "The wave passed through there 2 days ago." Jack felt his stomach turn. Everything's dead? Everything. And it's not like they dropped where they stood. They seemed to have just stopped moving, stopped living, stopped everything. Whatever this is, it doesn't leave bodies to rot. It leaves perfectly preserved corpses that will probably stay that way for years. Jack thought about his cattle in the south pasture, his horses in the barn, the visiting animals now crowding his property. All of them could look like that satellite image in 48 hours if the protection didn't work. If his grandfather's experience didn't translate to this new crisis, if he had miscalculated or misunderstood something crucial about how the sanctuary functioned. The weight of so many lives depending on his decisions was almost unbearable. He walked back outside, needing air and space to think. The white colts were gathered near the barn again, all facing south with that now familiar intensity. Jack approached the lead colt, and the animal turned to look at him with eyes that seemed to hold both reassurance and warning. "You know what's coming, don't you?" Jack said softly. "You've seen this before, or something like it." The colt pressed its forehead to his chest, and Jack felt that strange connection again, stronger this time. A sense of ancient knowledge being shared, of patterns repeating across generations. Tom Henderson came over, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool autumn air. "Strange business, all this. My cattle have settled down since we got here, like they know they're safe. But I keep thinking about all the animals we left behind, all the ranches that aren't protected. If this wave is as bad as Sarah says, we're going to lose everything that's not on your property." Jack nodded grimly. "That's why we need to convince more people to bring their animals here. We've got room for maybe twice what we have now." "The word's gone out," Tom replied. "But you know how stubborn ranchers can be. Half of them still think this is all nonsense." They're not going to risk moving their herds based on what they see as unproven theories and old wives' tales. Can't say I blame them entirely. If I hadn't seen what happened in 1952, I might feel the same way. The afternoon brought a few more ranchers with animals, but not as many as Jack had hoped. By evening, he estimated they had maybe 15% of the valley's livestock protected on his property. It was better than nothing, but it meant that when the wave hit, most of the valley's ranches would be devastated, lives would be ruined, families that had worked this land for generations would lose everything, and there was nothing Jack could do about it except hope that the protection held, and that those who had trusted him would at least survive. As darkness fell, Sarah conducted a final check of all the animals. They were distributed across Jack's property in carefully organized groups, each herd or flock separated to prevent mixing but close enough that the white colts could move among them. The colts had settled into a new pattern, stationing themselves at 5 points around the property's perimeter, 3 remaining with the main group near the barn. It looked almost military in its precision, like sentries taking up defensive positions. Jack stood on his porch watching the scene, his grandfather's journal open to the final entry from 1952. The night before it happened, my grandfather had written, "I walked the boundaries one last time." I could feel the land beneath my feet, could sense it gathering itself for what was coming. It's hard to describe, but it was like the earth was preparing to fight, drawing on reserves of strength I didn't know existed. I realized then that I wasn't protecting the land. The land was protecting me, protecting all of us who had chosen to stand with it. Sarah came to stand beside him, her presence a comfort in the gathering darkness. "Tomorrow," she said simply. Jack nodded. Tomorrow the wave would reach them, and they would discover whether the sanctuary that had worked 70 years ago would work again. Whether the white colts had chosen correctly in coming to his ranch. Whether he was worthy of the trust that had been placed in him by animals, by neighbors, by ancestors he had never known, but whose legacy he now carried. The white colts began to make that strange sound again, that resonant calling that seemed to vibrate in Jack's chest. One by one, the other animals on the property joined in. Cattle lowing, horses whinnying, dogs howling, all of them creating a chorus that rose into the night sky like a prayer or a challenge. Jack felt the hair on his arms stand up, felt something ancient and powerful stirring in the land beneath his feet. The battle was about to begin. Dawn broke clear and cold, the kind of morning that would normally have Jack appreciating the beauty of his land. Instead, he stood at the southern boundary of his property with Sarah and Tom Henderson, watching the horizon with dread-filled anticipation. According to Sarah's calculations, the wave would reach them by early afternoon. They had perhaps 6 hours to prepare for something none of them truly understood. The white colts had moved to the southern fence line during the night, all 15 of them standing shoulder to shoulder in a formation that looked almost like a barrier. They hadn't eaten since yesterday, hadn't drunk water, hadn't moved from their positions except to shift their weight occasionally. Their focus was absolute, their white forms stark against the autumn grass, their eyes fixed on something beyond human perception. Jack could feel it now, a wrongness in the air that set his teeth on edge and made his skin crawl. It wasn't temperature or humidity or any physical phenomenon he could name. It was more fundamental than that, a sense that something contrary to life itself was approaching. The animals felt it too. Every creature on his property was restless, moving nervously within their enclosures, their calls creating a constant background noise of anxiety and fear. By mid-morning, more ranchers had arrived, not to bring animals, but to witness what was happening. Word had spread through the valley that something unprecedented was occurring at Jack Tenner's ranch, and even the skeptics were curious enough to come see for themselves. They gathered in small groups near the house, talking in low voices, casting nervous glances toward the southern horizon where nothing visible had changed yet. Sarah had set up monitoring equipment along the fence line, instruments that measured electromagnetic fields, radiation levels, air quality, and a dozen other variables that might explain what they were facing. But so far, nothing unusual registered on any of her devices. Whatever the wave was, it existed outside the parameters of conventional science. It was as invisible to her instruments as it was to the naked eye, detectable only by the terror it inspired in every living thing in its path. Around noon, the white colts began to make that resonant sound again, but this time it was different. Not a call or a warning, but something that sounded almost like a battle cry. The sound grew louder and more insistent, and Jack felt it reverberating through his entire body, felt it sink into the ground beneath his feet and spread outward through the land. The earth itself seemed to respond, a subtle vibration that he could feel more than hear. Then Tom Henderson pointed south and said in a voice tight with fear, "Look, there." The horizon had changed. Not dramatically, but subtly. The air seemed thicker somehow, darker, as if a shadow was spreading across the landscape even though the sun still shone brightly overhead. Birds that had been circling in the distance suddenly fell from the sky like stones. A small herd of deer that had been grazing on the neighboring property dropped where they stood, their bodies hitting the ground in perfect synchronization. The wave had arrived. Jack watched in horror as the shadow spread closer, moving faster than he had expected. It flowed across the land like liquid darkness, and everywhere it touched, life simply stopped. Grass didn't wither or die in any conventional sense. It just ceased, the green blades turning gray and still. Trees didn't lose their leaves. They froze in place, as lifeless as painted scenery. And animals, any creature caught in the wave's path, collapsed instantly, their bodies preserved in whatever position they had occupied at the moment of contact. "It's going to hit the fence line in less than a minute," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Everyone needs to get back to the center of the property now." But Jack didn't move. He stood at the fence, watching the wave approach, watching the white colt stand firm against something that had killed everything in its path for hundreds of miles. The lead colt turned its head to look at him, and Jack understood what was required. He stepped over the fence line, placing himself between the property and the approaching wave. Sarah screamed his name, but he ignored her. This was what his grandfather had done. This was what the pattern demanded. The guardian standing at the boundary, offering himself as the first line of defense, showing the land that he was willing to sacrifice everything to protect what had been entrusted to him. The wave was 50 yards away now, close enough that Jack could see details. It wasn't really dark or shadowy. It was more like an absence, a negation of life so profound that it appeared as visible emptiness. It moved with inexorable purpose, and Jack knew that if it crossed onto his property, everything he had tried to save would die. The animals, the people, the white colts themselves. All of it would end, preserved in that terrible stillness. Jack planted his feet and spread his arms wide, a gesture that felt both futile and necessary. The white colts moved to flank him, 7 on each side, the lead colt directly at his back. Together they formed a living barrier, human and horse united against the approaching annihilation. The wave reached the fence line and stopped, held back by nothing visible, nothing measurable, nothing that should have been able to resist its advance. For a long moment, the wave pressed against the invisible boundary, and Jack felt the pressure of it like a physical weight trying to crush him. His knees buckled and he would have fallen except the lead colt pressed against his back, holding him upright. The other colts were making that resonant sound continuously now, and Jack felt the land beneath his feet responding, pushing back against the wave with a force that matched its own terrible power. The confrontation lasted an eternity, compressed into seconds. Jack's vision blurred, his ears rang, his entire body shook with the effort of standing against something that should have overwhelmed him instantly. But he held his ground, and the white colts held theirs, and the land held firm beneath them all. Slowly, incredibly, the wave began to recede. not defeated but deflected, flowing around the property boundaries like water around a stone, seeking easier paths north. Jack collapsed to his knees as the pressure released, gasping for air, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The white Colts surrounded him, their presence protective and approving. Behind him, he could hear people shouting, crying, calling his name, but he stayed where he was, watching the wave continue its northward journey, watching it flow past his property on both sides, killing everything beyond his boundaries, but leaving his land untouched. The protection had held. The sanctuary had proven true, and Jack Tenner, like his grandfather and great-great-grandfather before him, had stood at the boundary and survived what should have been impossible to survive. The silence that followed the wave's passage was absolute and terrible. Jack remained on his knees at the boundary, the white Colts surrounding him like guardian angels, while everyone on his property stood frozen in shock at what they had witnessed. Beyond the fence line, the world had become a monument to death. Trees stood perfectly still, their leaves caught mid-flutter. Grass extended in frozen waves where the wind had been moving through it. And in the distance, on neighboring properties, cattle and horses stood like statues, their bodies preserved in whatever action they had been performing when the wave struck. Sarah was the first to move, running to Jack and helping him to his feet. His legs trembled with exhaustion, and he leaned heavily on her as they walked back toward the center of the property. The white Colts followed, their defensive formation dissolving now that the immediate threat had passed. Behind them, the invisible barrier between life and death remained absolute. Nothing crossed it in either direction. The ranchers who had brought their animals to Jack's property wept with relief and grief in equal measure. Their livestock were safe, moving and breathing, and blissfully unaware of how close they had come to sharing the fate of everything beyond the fence line. But these saved animals represented only a fraction of what these families owned. The rest of their herds, the animals they had left behind because they couldn't believe the threat was real, were gone. Not sick or injured or scattered, but simply gone, transformed into lifeless monuments on properties that would never support life again. Tom Henderson stood at the southern fence, staring out at his ranch visible in the distance. Jack joined him, placing a hand on the older man's shoulder. Tom's face was streaked with tears. "I can see my house from here. See the cattle in my south pasture standing there like they're just waiting for me to come feed them. But they're dead, aren't they? All of them. Dead and frozen and never coming back." Jack didn't know what to say. The truth was too awful to voice, but silence felt like a betrayal. "Yes," he said finally. "I'm sorry, Tom. I'm so sorry." The older man nodded, accepting the truth with the stoic dignity of someone who had spent a lifetime dealing with loss on the unforgiving frontier. "At least I saved some. At least my grandchildren will have something to rebuild with. That's more than most people will have." Over the next few hours, the full scope of the devastation became clear. The wave had passed through the entire valley, killing everything in its path, except for Jack's property and the animals sheltered there. Emergency services were overwhelmed, not with casualties in the traditional sense, but with the impossible task of documenting and responding to an event that defied explanation. News helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting images of the lone green property surrounded by a gray wasteland of frozen death. Government officials arrived by evening, scientists and military personnel and bureaucrats who demanded explanations Jack couldn't provide. He told them about the white Colts, about his grandfather's journal, about the land's mysterious protection. They listened with expressions that ranged from skepticism to wonder, but none of them could offer better explanations for what had occurred. The instruments that Sarah had deployed showed nothing unusual: no radiation, no chemical contamination, no measurable phenomenon that could account for the wave or for Jack's immunity to it. As night fell on that terrible day, Jack sat on his porch with his grandfather's journal open to the final page. His grandfather had written only one entry after the 1952 crisis ended. The horses left today, all 15 of them, walking south toward whatever home they came from. I watched them go and felt both relief and sadness. Relief that the danger had passed, sadness that I would never fully understand what we had experienced together. But I know this much. The land remembers. The pattern will repeat. And when it does, my descendants will have to make the same choice I made. To stand or to flee, to protect or to abandon, or to trust in something older than understanding, or to demand explanations that will never come. Jack looked up from the journal to see the white colts gathering near the barn, forming that same tight circle they had made when they first arrived. The lead colt approached the porch and climbed the steps with surprising grace, coming to stand before Jack one final time. It pressed its forehead to his chest in that gesture of connection and trust, and Jack felt tears streaming down his face as he understood what was happening. "You're leaving," he whispered. The colt stepped back and made a soft sound that seemed like both farewell and blessing. Then it turned and rejoined the others, and together the 15 white colts began walking south, moving with purpose across Jack's property toward the devastated lands beyond. Jack wanted to call them back, wanted to keep them safe within the sanctuary that had protected them. But he understood now that they didn't need his protection. They had never needed it. They had come to offer protection, not to receive it, and now their work was done. He watched until the white forms disappeared into the distance, heading back to wherever they had come from, leaving behind a valley forever changed, and a man who finally understood his place in a pattern that stretched back generations and would continue forward into a future he would never see. The land beneath his feet felt different now, alive with an awareness he had never noticed before. Or perhaps he was simply finally attuned to something that had always been there, waiting for him to recognize it. Sarah came to stand beside him as the last white colt vanished from sight. "What now?" she asked. Jack closed his grandfather's journal and looked out at his property, the island of life in a sea of death, the sanctuary that would slowly help the valley recover and rebuild. "Now we document everything. We make sure the next generation knows what happened here. We keep the pattern alive so that when the white colts come again, whoever stands where I'm standing will know what to do." "They keep coming," he said softly, echoing his words from that first impossible morning. "And we keep protecting them. That's how this works. That's how it's always worked. The cycle continuing generation after generation, guardians and sanctuaries and mysterious white horses appearing when darkness threatened." It was terrifying and wonderful and sacred, and Jack Tenner had become part of something far greater than one man's life or one ranch in the Colorado mountains. He had become part of the pattern, and the pattern would endure.